great day.
So I have a question. So when I was writing the article, so I'm doing the first and I'm saying yes that they were both affected negatively by slavery, but I'm saying that they were both affected but in different ways. Okay. So if I say one paragraph, for the reason I have is there were family structures which is straight. So in one paragraph I'm writing black families and white families, and one paragraph the other reason white were morally corrupt because of slavery. And then that paragraph was white people. And then the last reason is how the blacks were mentally and physically abused. And then talk about that part. Is that okay? Yeah. Well, that's okay. Okay.
Wait.
Because people were saying you need black and white.
In the same paragraph.
Yeah. But
Others what people were saying, I'm like, why?
yeah, that's because I have one paragraph just
Okay,
for
so normally if you're going to be describing the way that they're mutually affected, in each one you should describe whites and blacks.
But then
But
if
the
they're
way
not.
that you just explained it to me
Yeah.
is fine. Because
Okay.
you have one where you're saying how they're affected in like the same way. You have another one saying whites were morally corrupted, but on the other hand, blacks were affected.
yeah, so those are two separate paragraphs. So the white morally corrupt and not the blacks. Yeah. So got it. Okay, thank you. I was so scared to remind
You could say unlike the slave.
Thank you, Ms.
Yeah.
Buchanan.
I wrote two paragraphs and I wrote two
Just let me read it.
Yeah, I'm doing that tomorrow. I don't know.
For what you had?
Yeah, tomorrow.
For the arts. For
Oh.
Team Ed. This is a present
I
for
think
Team
because
Ed.
there's another class going to this
Really?
class, yeah, for period 2.
It's just, the only thing is just making it a little bit more consistent, right?
Yeah.
So slavery mutually affected whites
Yeah,
and blacks,
this is
the
all
ways
about-
they experienced
but it's like
here,
space.
and
Well, and still can have it.
like
Yeah.
within, like,
I don't
obviously
think
there
it's
was
gonna happen.
like
It's just almost
groups,
like-
within
I'll
also
do it
within
later.
groups,
No.
in your
I
work
did it.
was- Okay, so then you would want to say, okay, so slavery mutually affected whites and blacks in the way that they both experienced fear. It caused societal
We had this argument.
divisions.
I mean,
Not
I didn't
like able to
based on the
and as a result, they both had blood. Right? It's like change the wording, but all the ideas are the same. So,
Are
like,
separated.
is this
And
how
that
they
would- This is how they would, I'm doing the difference between how
Yeah, as long as you
mistresses
have
and
some
women slaves were
examples.
affected.
Alright. I'm comparing
Like-
it's just the
How
way
they just say
the
it.
women to the males. How women were more affected. Like in the women.
The white women were more affected.
Than the regular men. Because the regular men are
We
already
can still like think of like
I need to talk about it in like,
Alright.
Not
I'm just
really.
gonna ask her.
I just have to like add it. Thank you.
So for my reasons, I have fear and families. My other reason is power. So for the white, I wrote about white.
Yeah, I'll know that you do Friday. Thursday and Friday.
For blacks, can I say like, can I use the example that
I was talking about how Mrs. Hall was mentally manipulated by her husband. How she was
Yeah.
not able
or
to.
because that was
He
beneficial
didn't let her.
to him,
Wait,
but it was
oh,
bad.
it is
It
different,
doesn't-
right?
The one that wasn't allowed to teach regardless of the alphabet.
It can be
Oh, that's
my,
right. He mentally corrupted her by changing her from an
my
expert
sister-
to a
Yeah.
slave feeding
Yeah.
person.
That's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, just to keep it fair.
How like white are getting more affected by the males. But she didn't.
Then black males.
No, remember how it said in the book? It was like she like tried to do better than him. So then it said that. Alright. I'm gonna ask you.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, so I changed my thesis from I didn't do white women before. And it's,
I'm ready to rewrite everything.
and then so each paragraph so I started with prime example of how black women were compared to white mistresses and the treatment of black women was different. Okay. And then I did how she was sexually abused and how that would never happen to a white mistress. Or,
Okay, so the one thing that I can tell you is you don't want to just start off, like, what is the point that you're, like, proving here, okay? So you want to think back to your thesis, and if your first you're starting off with sexual abuse.
Yeah.
So this has to go
Oh,
in
in order?
Okay.
Sorry.
So you want to kind of just restate your thesis
Yeah.
in the beginning, because this is helping you to prove a statement. You have to explain what that
So
statement is.
through sexual abuse is
An example, exactly. And then a prime example of this could
And then
be.
like at the end I would say like this is completely different than how because I wanted to include how white women were treated, and I tried to at the end of each body paragraph, like how that they were that
Yeah,
would never
okay.
happen to them. Like the situation that she was put in. And would you consider the mission?
Okay, so the one thing is that if you're going to include, because the whole point of this is you're talking about their position in the slaveholding world.
Yeah.
Okay? So if you're saying that they're inferior to white men, that's kind of the point that you're proving, right? And they're inferior in these three ways. What you're kind of doing is you wind up comparing enslaved women and white mistresses, and you don't necessarily talk about the position of women overall.
Because originally I had it comparing enslaved women and men, but then I didn't include the white mistresses, so I tried to change
Okay,
it.
so what you have so far is a lot of really good examples,
Yeah.
okay? But you need to think about what each of these is helping you to prove, because this doesn't necessarily match your thesis, okay? So you're pretty much done.
Yeah.
But what you need to do instead is,
And
like all these
analysis-
examples,
analysis based
all
on-
of these examples are fine, but you need to rethink your thesis, okay? So the point that you're trying to prove is that women were inferior to men,
Mhm.
right, in the slaveholding world.
Well, I'm saying, assuming that all women are inferior to men, this is the main part that I'm trying to prove, that there's a difference between mistreatment of enslaved women and white mistresses. Like, that's the main part that I'm trying to prove. So I'm saying, even though they're both inferior, there's a huge difference between the mistreatment of enslaved women and white mistresses.
Okay, so then really what you have to prove first that they're inferior to men, okay? So ways that they were manipulated by men. And then you can talk about how it's worse for slaves than it is for mistresses.
So for Patsy, it could be like she was held to a higher standard than most women that were on the same foundation as her. Like, could that be an example? That does not show that they're inferior.
Okay, so your thesis should sound something more like women had an inferior position in the slaveholding world, as seen in how white mistresses had to listen to their husbands unquestioningly, how enslaved women had to, put up with. Because the main idea is you want to talk about their position and what role they have.
Each different one.
Yes.
Okay. So it should be like a two-part thesis that explains what white mistresses had to go through and then what enslaved women had to go through. And how they were inferior through these ways.
Yes. I think what you're complicating it, right?
Mhm.
I know that you want to compare enslaved women and white mistresses, which you can do by talking throughout your paper. But still, the major point you're trying to prove is that they were inferior to men, right?
But in
Like
some
that's-
cases, they weren't. Enslaved women weren't really inferior to men. Because they didn't have to, they weren't, so most of them got to work in the house and they didn't work as hard. I don't know. I talked about how her husband manipulated her, all
Yeah.
like that.
See, you have really great examples. I'm just trying to like help you summarize what you're saying.
Yeah, the analysis.
Yeah.
Patsy was kind of like two-sided. She was also in fear. She was also abused by Mrs. Epps
Yeah.
as well
Exactly.
as Mr. Epps.
Yeah.
So that's like kind of confusing. To
But that's also
portray.
kind of your point,
Yeah.
right? Is that
They would.
while
yeah.
in the slaveholding world men were clearly the superior, it
Mhm.
was still worse for
Enslaved women than. Yeah.
yeah.
But I have the woman, like I have the difference between white mistresses and enslaved women, but I don't have. So should I add more evidence to prove that they were inferior to men? Each. I can have a quote because I remember. I think I said that Mrs. Old was changed by her husband from like a nice and warm person into like she was cruel to the slaves, and that shows how her husband mentally manipulated her.
Okay, so I think that the best organization of this would be to talk about one paragraph of how like slave women were treated.
Mm-hmm.
A paragraph on how white women were treated,
Yeah.
and then a paragraph that involves both. So when we're talking about like women, like you said with Patsy and Mrs. Epps,
Yeah.
basically how they're both inferior, but still 100% you have blacks are inferior to whites. Because that's really the point that you're proving, is that in the slaveholding world, women were inferior, but the more inferior out of
So the first
exactly.
paragraph is, I think that's the best opportunity to make that into it because
Yes.
I still say that Mrs. Epps abused the enslaved woman, but she also was cheated on by her husband, and she had like I could use a quote how he said like if you want to go back to poverty you can, but like yeah.
Yeah, so like,
And then the other two, because I talk about separation of family with Eliza, and then Mrs. All. So those could be the black slave woman, and then it could be the white mistresses and how they were treated differently. And then the other one could be men were superior, but also black women slaves were